clip of his later tonight, but I don't want to make our special guest hang out any longer. He's been hanging out in the green room. He's chilling. He's over here on Twitter at Jay's Analysis. He's also got an event coming up in Austin, Texas, February 11th. You can go to his Twitter and check that out. Jay, how you doing tonight? You had a big night on Friday. Timcast, welcome. Oh, you're muted. But that's how it goes on this show, especially on a night like tonight.
Yeah, man. What's up? Yeah, I'm super out of it. Like we flew in from all that and then immediately went to the Burmis event, the Awaken America event. So I was trying to hurry to catch Roger Stone and all these people, but I which I didn't, but I did get to catch to Burmis and meet him for the first time. So it was a kind of a packed in weekend there. I got to meet everybody.
Did you get to meet Clay Clark?
I did a podcast with him the other day.
Oh, right on.
So, but I didn't meet him at the event. No.
Yeah, he does. He's been coordinating. I think it's the Reawaken America tour that Burmis was probably speaking at. Correct. And yeah, Jason's spoken at several of those. He does an awesome job. I'm glad you got to meet him in person because he's a character, and you find out he's we're like his YouTube videos. Like it's not, he's like that 24/7. The first
we're in the era where people are who they are online. Right?
Yeah.
We're not in the era where people like have a character unless they're a Fed or something like that. Like Alex is Alex in person, Burmis is Burmis in person. So
yeah. And first time we met Burmis, he was like the Vatican's protecting, child trafficking and all this sort of stuff. And so his research has gotten better over the years, but like he's still on the same track that he was on 15 years ago, as far as like tracking down legitimate leads. And so that's cool that you got to meet him. I was kind of like, I didn't know that the picture that you took, like sent me the other day, I was like, oh, you just left Timcast. How would you see Burmis? But that makes sense that you made it to the
as soon as we got back, that event was going on. And Burmis was like, hey, let's hang out. Yeah. So we rushed over there as quick as we could. As soon as like literally when the plane landed, we went directly to that event. So that was pretty wild. Yeah, there was thousands of people at that event. So that was actually a lot bigger than I expected it to be. But anyway, so thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be on GTW.
Well, I want to thank you for going on a Timcast, bringing your books, actually getting airtime where they were interested, they were paying attention. I felt like they were moving forward, that there was growth happening.
Yeah,
I'd been waiting for years to see some of those things discussed on a forum like that. And it was a good rite of passage, I think, for them. And I hope that you planted some strong seeds. For Luke, it's like, Gretzky finds Yari Curry, and now you guys are passing back and forth on the show. And Tim's just like, what's going on?
It was, it felt like Jordan Pippen. I'm not saying who's who.
Yeah, there you go.
I was glad he was basketball. I was glad he's there to back up. Like you're saying that, like, I don't know anything about hockey. So I'm like,
yeah, that's good. Let's go.
Who's that?
I know equally as I know enough to know that's a good reference that you dropped. That's basketball.
I was glad he was there to kind of, like you said, a lot of it kind of went down as you were kind of, prepping me ahead of time in regard to the Crowder DW stuff. And when we got there, it was like this big game room, and there's pool tables and a skate park inside the house. And I'm like, this is crazy. What's going on? Oh, there's like Jackass, right? Like he built a skate park in his house. Is this going to be like Jackass? And he got there a little bit later and just shot some pool with Tim Pool, playing pool
on a Tim pool table. Yeah,
on a Tim pool table. And then we went into the studio when Luke got there and just kind of chilled for an hour. And at first I was a little awkward because I brought out the books and they were like,
yeah, oh geez.
I was like, what are you doing with all these books? What is this? What are you doing? I was like, well, this is my shtick, dude. I bring the books. And he's like, okay, I guess we can go to that. so we went to that eventually. Like at first it was a little awkward. I didn't know if it was going to jive very well. At first it was kind of like, these dudes aren't going to like my style, my presentation. And so I was like, so I'm here to talk about the N-word. They were like, no. I was like, I'm just joking, man. So no, do not do that. I was like, I'm not going to do that. Don't worry. It's just joking. So So I freaked him out, and then I like calmed it down. And anyway, but after about the first 10 minutes of chatting, when the show started, is actually the first time I felt like it was really starting to go well. And yeah, I had to try to throw things, plugs in there as quick as I could here and there. But yeah, I mean, it's a fast paced show, and I went in knowing that it's not interview, it's news commentary. So everything's got to be boom, 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 boom. And we spent about an hour ahead of time, picking out what stories they wanted to talk about. They were like, "What do you want to talk about?" I'm like, "I want to talk about these books." That's why I brought them. Let's talk about that. So I tried to interject the books, as best I could. So I was glad, like I said, Luke kind of backed up a lot of the references. Ian seemed to be really engaged in the first hour when we were talking. He was really into the philosophy, and hey, man, that's cool that you study philosophy. Let's get into that. Maybe we can do more shows down the road. So seemed to have a really good response, and they seem to want to, maybe do some more shows down the road.
Yeah, so we're gonna play that chunk from when you got comfortable in the show, about 20 minutes in, and took control. And I was like, let's see how long this goes. And I think it went to the top of the hour, which is very unusual for Tim to give up that much control, because he likes to have the articles in front of him and being, but there was some level of trust there. And then once you started unfolding some stuff with verifiable, there's references behind these things, right? Then that checks off his like news guard. We got to be able to talk about facts and facts only. Well, these are really good sources. Zbigniew Brzezinski said this. What's he going to say? Yeah. And so you were able to hold court there for a good solid like 40 minutes, dude. And then you went with the flow for the rest, and you didn't try to like force it. You're like, I got a good presentation in there, and those guys absorbed probably about as much as they're going to. Because you mentioned Cecil Rhodes and De Beers, and I'm pretty sure that's not on their radar, but they didn't get any questions from Tim on that. Whereas
Ian, they saw the sticky notes. They saw the sticky notes, and Tim was like, "You got all the sticky notes." I was like, "Yeah, man, they're not fake. Like they're sticky notes for a reason." So I think he was like, "All right, this dude's legit. He's got sticky notes."
And then Ian's like, okay, so this Fabian Socialist group back in the 1800s, and he starts digging into it, because like while Tim's talking, Ian has time to type a couple things in and get some stubs of like knowledge to grow on, right?
Right.
So I was like, well, if you can just like lay out for them, it's like, Ingsoc from 1984 is English socialism of the Fabian variety, and Fabius Maximus was the war of attrition, attack them from behind, starve their supply lines type of mentality. And then they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and they're the stained glass with the hammering of the world in their image. That's pretty verifiable. That's not conspiracy theory, and that's something like Ian or Tim or someone could dig into and actually start to grow from. So I think you planted a ton of good seeds. And I was interested in talking tonight about, like, you brought books that you didn't get to touch on during that show. My audience wants to know.
I do have them here with me. So, I mean,
you have a book camp?
Well, it's not hooked up to Zoom.
Okay, right on.
But like, I mean, I've got I do have the stacks of everything that I brought to Timcast here with me. So,
all right, cool.
But I mean, we really only kind of brushed over various texts, but I do have them all here, so we can talk about whatever. But one thing that I thought worked out really well, which I read a lot of the comments, and it was bringing in the Plato element that seemed to really jive with people very well.
Yeah, because Ian loves Plato, but he didn't know why.
Yeah, and that led into, I think, the plug for the philosophy course. So hopefully that kind of directed people in our direction.
Have you considered running ads for your philosophy course in front of Tim's show and saying, hey Timcast, Jay Dyer here, and like pitching your course? Because you could do that. We've done that for this podcast. And I think it was something like,
I'm not following. Hey Tim, what do you mean, like, hey Timcast?
Oh, we've bought an ad before for Grand Theft World that we ran on YouTube.
On Tim? Oh, okay.
That YouTube runs in front of replays of his show, because he sells advertising, right?
Oh,
so we said something like, hey, I'm a fan of Timcast, daily news, that sort of thing. Great. But you also need historical context. That's why we have Grand Theft World. And then people who are like, oh yeah, I need the daily news. That's cool, Tim. Thank you. But I also need historical context.
Yeah.
They don't have an answer for that. Grand Theft World. So you could do something similar, and you could take a clip from the show. So it's like, oh, is this a clip from the show? And then you have a call to action.
I got you. Yeah,
for your philosophy course.
Awesome.
Yeah,
good idea.
That was just an idea I had.
Marketing master Richard Grove, exactly.
Well, I think freedom has a marketing problem, and good messages deserve like the knowledge that we have and experience, like to get out there. And we'll talk about Daily Wire and how much they invest in Facebook and how close they are to big tech and those sort of things. But I don't think it's wrong for an entrepreneur on an
Yeah.
individual level to use the powers that are to get
Sure.
the freedom message out there while we can. All right. So the book stacks that you brought to Timcast. Did you have like a book bag? Like, is it a backpack?
I
on
did.
there?
No, I
What
had a
did you get?
giant. I stuffed as much as I could in my little, carrying duffel bag that I carry with me. I brought. I tried to pick out the ones that I thought would be the most relevant to, what I know of Timcast and their vibe. So I
Yeah.
brought.
All right. So hold on. Let's make a game of this. Everyone at home, write down how many books did you bring?
2, 3, 6. Roughly 13, 14.
That's pretty good. All right. Everyone at home, if you're playing this game, make a list of books you think Jay would have taken. Because at the end of the H.G. Wells Time Machine, there's books missing and they hypothesize what books did he take with him. We're going to do the same thing right now because freedom's cooler than H.G. Wells. So what books did Jay take with him? Go ahead and make your list. You guys got a couple ideas. And then when you give us the books, Jay, what's the book and why'd you bring it? And we'll kind of break into each one. That way folks would understand the arsenal of tools you brought to help assail the audience who might have ignorance in these areas.
Right. So I think everybody in your audience will, we do have some new people coming over from my audience that I plugged this tonight. So a lot of these will be new to people maybe in my crowd who might come from the religious or philosophical vein of things. They might not be familiar with the geopolitical stuff, especially from the 20th century. These are a couple kind of must-haves, and they won't be foreign to anybody in Richard's audience. But we have two of the Bertrand Russell texts that are really important. We have Scientific Outlook and Impact of Science on Society. And the reason that I brought them was just that he's a great go-to guy for his membership in the Fabian Society for a little while. But of course, I don't think he ever ceased having essentially the worldview of the Fabians, even though he supposedly distanced himself from it. It's the same idea. 1931 is when he wrote Scientific Outlook. And of course, Russell is a member of the Royal Society. He's considered, I think, through propaganda, the most important philosopher and logician of the last couple centuries. That's all propaganda, not because he's not a logician, but just that it's all part of that British imperial strategy of promoting relativism, empiricism, et cetera, atheism.
Yeah, and part of his logic was a whole new logic he came up with, which is not formal logic of Aristotle and what was used for 1500 to 2000 years. It's symbolic logic with Albert North Whitehead and Principia Mathematica, which takes a self-reference, takes the reality out of it, takes, sort of trying to come up with a scientifically perfected language is sort of the terminology I believe they use.
Exactly. And going along with that point, early on in this book, he makes a very wild statement that, well, since David Hume, we really can't even know that there is an external world. And so it's ironic because, the man touted as sort of the apex of, science, of reasoning, of logic, is admitting from the outset that it's a radical form of relativism. We don't even know if any of this is true. But by the way, we'll just pretend that it is. And so I actually made a list. I won't take too much time reading this, but I thought it was funny to see his definitions throughout this book as to what science is. So this is going to be funny because you're going to say, wait a minute, this is all over the place. So first is science is what is based on experiment and not tradition. Okay, I mean that one seems plausible, not too controversial there. But wait a minute, let's listen to all the definitions of science here. And what we're going to notice is that it's actually propaganda. And it's so loose as to be anything, everything, and nothing all at once. Science is. I'm gonna have to put on my boomer glasses.
Sounds like a good.
I can't even read.
Put mine on, dude. I just put mine on.
So let's go full boomer here. Full boomer nerd scholar. Science only provides probabilities and not certitude. Science is empiricism. Scientists are those who have reasons. Science is knowledge. Knowledge of general laws or facts is what science is. Science begins with Galileo.
He's contradicting for people who aren't aware. That's just this chain.
And there's a bunch more. Science is, quote, progress. Science is the power of manipulating nature. Science is almost a form of divine providence. These are all from this book. Science is induction, but is not deductive reasoning. The scientific method is omnipotent. Science is knowledge that does not stand alone, but exists within a general body of scientific accepted knowledge, which, by the way, that's not empirical. So we're noticing the contradictions there. Science is based on the assumptions of things that are unverifiable. The authority in science is not reliable. But notice that Bertrand Russell had just told you that
Science
on his
is
authority,
omnipotent.
yeah, on his authority, science is
Omnipotent, man. It's got all the power.
What? So notice these two statements. Science is based on assumptions that are not verifiable. Science is not based on authority. But he just made an authority claim about what science is based on that is not verifiable, which again, this is self-repeating.
Yep.
Science is not
circular because what he's saying is you can't get underneath the axioms or foundations of reality itself. Yeah.
Science shows us that there is not a soul, but only matter. These are universal claims. Of course, science can't do that if it's an empirical methodology.
So
science
it's like a scientific backup of what Wundt was saying, because Wundt said that human beings had no soul and that they could be manipulated like clockwork oranges.
Exactly.
These sort of, okay.
Well, and I, speaking of that, I actually brought another book that they found very fascinating, which is Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, where dolphin freak John C. Lilly says that humans are just programmable meat computers.
But he didn't do it on purpose. Hey,
No.
the other thing, when you brought up Lilly, do you know that Lilly did the adrenochrome studies for the National Institutes of Health? And I have them in a stack over here. If you've never seen them, I'll bring them out while you're reading these facts. But it was like Humphrey Osmond in 1971. It was interesting. So I'll dig it out because we had talked about that a couple years ago.
Science is in decay. Everything ends with Hume and Berkeley. And so he's saying that we can't know there's an external world.
Right. Right.
Science is an entire worldview and is the basis for man's civilization. Science is, in Bertrand Russell, scientism. This is my analysis of all these phrases. Science. Oh, but there's more. Science is power thought. I don't know what that means. Science is causal knowledge of bodies. So you'll notice that this is all over the place. It's basically a form of propaganda, and science is basically scientism. That's the whole point of all this. All of these like 20 different conflicting definitions and explanations of science.
Science is what strong people say
what they say it is.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I want to deliver because I know somebody was incredulous about John Lilly and adrenochrome. So here's two documents we've talked on the show before. Now, the first one here is the adrenochrome hypothesis in psychiatry, Humphrey Osmond. This says anyway, they did some of the first research, and it had to be where Hunter Thompson got his early knowledge of such things for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But that's not what we're here. Let's see. I think this one's it. On modified human agents, John Lilly. Let's see. Personal papers, Stanford, human agents, brain research. Let's see. If adrenochrome's not in here, it's because this other document is always with this John Lilly document. But let's check it out. Oh, wait. Building modified human agents. Let's bring this microphone over here. Let me just search real. Go ahead, Jay. Keep.
I didn't bring these, but on this.
Are you done with Bertrand Russell?
No, I brought the other one, his other one, but all right. On this point of Lilly, I always think it's funny to bring up that in his biography, his autobiography, the introduction was written by Timothy Leary, and Timothy Leary says, John C. Lilly is amongst the pioneers of the second age of exploration. He's like a new Aleister Crowley. He's a new Aldous Huxley. I thought that was a fascinating comparison from Timothy Leary there.
All right. So apparently this NIH experiment this is John Lilly and it's HHS. And there's interesting things about them doing mind control, electrostimulation.
Well, here's in Lilly's biography. Here's his brain chips that the first ones he came up with. So here's where they put them in the brain of the monkeys. Here's the actual chips and the frequencies. This is in, I think, the 50s when he was doing this with the monkeys. So he started with monkeys before he moved on to the dolphins. But
And then he's using Ewan Cameron's techniques from MK Ultra.
Yeah.
And then Lilly writes that a technique for covert, relatively safe implantation of electrodes into the human brain has been devised. And this direct electrical injection is what Schwab's talking about in his appendix for Fourth Industrial Revolution called
Right.
deep shift.
yeah,
So,
I didn't take
yeah,
any of
sort
the
of
Lilly.
like-
Go ahead.
Sorry to cut in. I was just going
No,
to
it's
say,
fine.
sort of like an analogy to that movie, Altered States, because he was someone who's,
Yeah.
a part of the deep state in regards to the CIA machinations around the late 60s, early 70s movement, the hippie movement, which is largely a social engineering project. And I remember when because I think Altered States had something to do that movie from the 80s. I believe
That was
where,
Patty
like,
Chayefsky who wrote
It's
that.
Yeah,
Altered
he's done
States
it
is
on-
based on John C. Lilly. Yeah,
it is okay. Yeah.
There's a chapter in the book about him talking about it. Saying,
Isolation
this was-
tanks.
I thought because
And
isolation
based on
tanks, it
the-
wasn't. He was on ketamine or something. Not
Yeah.
in the movie, but I think John Lilly used ketamine and isolation tanks in order to.
Yeah, here he's got the tank and the poster in his autobiography.
That explains a lot then.
All right. So real
Yeah,
quick.
I didn't bring the autobiography. I just brought the actual. But by the way, this book is unreadable. I have no idea what he's talking about in half of the baloney in here. I think
his
the most relevant.
autobiography. Oh no, that one. I
Oh,
see.
this one.
It's in
the-
Dolphinese, that's why.
Yeah, he's speaking dolphin. Maybe that's why. But I think the most relevant sections are where he talks about experimenting on kids. So what does that tell you?
All right, so I conflated two studies, so I want to disambiguate. So this has nothing to do with John Lilly, but it is the National Institutes of Mental Health. It is the adrenochrome study that they had done back in the 59 and 65, it looks like. And then the National Institutes of Mental Health, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, with R.D. Lang from MK Ultra, doing the same sort of experimentation that Lilly was doing over here in this HHS paper. So that's why those two papers are together in the stack. So it's still interesting about the overlaps between Lilly's research, MK Ultra, and Altered States is a good
I always
flick.
find it interesting that behaviorists need to remove the soul component. The thing that they can, conceptualization, the immaterial.
Well, it gives them
component, the
plausible
spiritual component.
deniability. If you're
But
not
it's the
messing
only
with
way
something-
their behavioral studies work if they remove it. So they have to either school it out of us or traumatize people out of it or do whatever they can in order to try to isolate that mechanism so they can create the perfect automatons they're trying to model in their perfect societies. But anyways.
So
All right, Jake, so you brought this and you brought this one. Oh no, you brought this Scientific Outlook, right?
and
have you ever-
yeah,
do you have this
impact and scientific outlook is what I brought.
This is one from 1913 that he did. He talks about eugenics, world government, controlling of education, war, and war as a way of life, warfare.
There's another couple of interesting points that are forgotten in scientific outlook too, which is that he mentions geoengineering, he mentions weather control. I mean, he mentions genetic modification. He mentions peak oil as a scam. Interesting. He says that we'll use peak oil in the notion of controlled or scarcity of resources to then create, literally says an environmental movement on page 109, which would be a means of control. And then he says that we'll have to get control of pesticides and bio-warfare and master blights to control breeding science. So he makes a connection between blights, pandemics, breeding science. And then he says we'll create synthetic foods. And by the way, the elite, he says, will eat steaks. This is page 120. The elite will eat steaks while the masses will eat fake food, fake meat, beyond burger. Zibugs, yes.
Zibugs.
I've got a lot of fake meat. It's gonna be really good. It's gonna be it's recycled human feces that we made into a steak. It's gonna get those numbers down. By the way, somebody did a really good Bill Gates.
We got to get him
Who
down to
was?
zero, man. He bought up all the farmland, then he
Yeah.
developed non-meat based foods, and then he was part of the pandemic. I mean, he's hitting on all cylinders these days, and he didn't even finish college, let alone go to med school.
Probably make more money than he ever has.
He's frontman. He's frontman of history. Whether
Yeah,
it's
and then, of course-
Zuckerberg or any of the rest of them, man, they're just frontmen. Bill Gates, is
Right.
also making those moves. Yeah, that's classy.
Impact
53.
was this classic.
So is he
I think
trying to, in that book or in the Scientific Outlook, we read it a couple of times on the show, but is he trying to what you were highlighting, Jay, build a straw man around the idea that they need those sorts of specious arguments in order to justify the type of world society they're attempting to create? Or does he actually believe that there is like the Malthusian doctrine of geometric growth and so forth, in the sense that there is going to be peak oil, there's going to be peak resource usage? I'm just wondering if he just acknowledges the fact that these are fake sort of specious straw men they're building up, or if he's actually believing in
Well, he wants you to believe it.
Well, certainly he wants us
Good
to. I
question. Yeah,
disagree,
let me see what he said about.
I got a Malthus quote right here. Oh, let's see. This is education, but I got Malthus right here. There was another page that was all marked up with Malthus here. When things don't go right. Okay, so let's just go through. War as an institution becomes an everyday type thing. World state, bringing about a world state. Eugenic conditions, birth rate for depopulation, and education is usually treated as a means of prolonging the status quo by instilling prejudices rather than creating free thought and a noble outlook by example of generous feeling and the stimulus of mental adventure. But that's not the Malthus quote I'm looking for. So I'm going to acquiesce. What do you got? I got Spinoza.
Yeah, so here's the peak oil section. This was 1931. He says, one of the most difficult problems of modern technique is that of raw materials. Industry uses up a continually increasing rate of substances which have been stored throughout geological time in the Earth's crust. These are not being replaced in any usable form. One of the most flagrant instances of this is oil. The supply of oil in the world is limited, and the consumption of oil is continually and rapidly increasing. It will probably not be very long before the world's supply is practically exhausted. Thus, useless indeed the wars which will take place on the possession of oil, and sufficiently destructive to reduce the level of civilization to a point where oil will no longer be needed. We may, I suppose, assume that our civilization has not suffered a cataclysm, that some substantial substitute for oil will be discovered as oil becomes more expensive through its rarity. But as this example shows, industrial technique can never become static and traditional as agricultural techniques did in former times. Thus will be necessary to invent new processes of finding new forms of energy. And then he goes into wind farms. So he predicted the wind farm scam back then. Now, so he seems to be saying that, like passing it off like, oh, there won't be,
it's an inevitability.
As if it's yeah.
I got the Fabian Scientific Organization aspect. This is 1913. He's writing about this. So this is Fabian. So he's recommending how to manage the future. But I did find the Malthus quote. Malthus's statement of population question had been true enough up to the time when he wrote. It is still true of barbarous and semi-civilized races and of the worst elements among civilized races. But it has become false as regards the more civilized half of the population of Western Europe and America. Among them, instinct no longer suffices to keep numbers even stationary. So this is interesting because he says it applies to the rest of the world, but not so much in Western countries.
It's funny because that's in contradiction of even modern anthropology, but I won't.
Yeah, chapter 11 is all on Malthus, and the technique that he's talking about there is the technique of controlling population.
And then peak oil. Did you ever read this book by Thomas Gold of Cornell?
No, I have not, but I did find do you remember Fletcher Prouty?
Oh yeah, Fletcher
Prouty.
Have you seen that video where he talks about it? There's a video of him talking about it.
All right, so Thomas Gold is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow at the Royal Society, emeritus professor of physics at Cornell University, regarded as one of the most creative and wide-ranging scientists of his generation. So this book, Deep Hot Biosphere, Thomas Gold sets forth truly controversial and astonishing theories about where oil and gas come from and how they acquire their organic signatures. The conclusions he reaches in this book may at first be difficult to believe, but they are supported by a growing body of evidence and by the indisputable stature and seriousness Gold brings to any scientific enterprise. In this book, we see a brilliant and boldly original thinker, increasingly a rarity in modern science, as he develops a revolutionary new view about the fundamental workings of our planet. He says that oil is abiotic and it's generated by the earth and not a finite supply. And that the people who own such industries don't want you to know that, because then you wouldn't give them so much money for something that's not
a renewable
scarce.
Resource that actually replenishes itself quite quickly. And they play this scam between what's been drilled for, what's known to exist through seismic sort of measurements, or sort of radar type of measurements, however they use to look at underground cavities that have oil, and then what's speculated to exist. And so they play this sort of game between speculation and what they know to exist in order to prop up the price of oil. That goes back to, oh my
You know,
decades ago.
one other thing that it's that's overlooked too, I think, is the way that he speaks of Soviet Russia and other countries that had Western created philosophies exported to them, particularly Bolsheviks as well. Bolshevism, Sovietism, Maoism. He calls them experiments, and he says the Nazi experiment. So there's essentially techniques of experimental techniques of control, according to Bertrand Russell.
So he looks at it as like social engineering, essentially a continuation of Bentham, and social sciences, sociology, Auguste Comte, and positivism.
Bentham,
and ideas.
Malthus, Locke all worked for the East India Company, and therefore were influenced and paid by the monopoly that had opium, the opium monopoly. Call them that. There's actually a book by Lamott,
well,
I think, called the Opium Monopoly. But let's go back to Bertie Russell.
Yeah, the later chapters in Impact of Science on Society are fascinating, because what's funny is that I actually had some haters try to come after me on this book.
Injections, injunctions.
Me too. I actually
because they'll say that, oh, in the first part of the book, he's just being hypothetical about what could happen, but he doesn't actually believe it. No, if you read the rest of the book, he goes on to say, no, we do need a Platonic ideal state, which does put into play a global government, which destroys all nation states, a world state, he says on page 94, which controls population and outlaws nation states.
Besides 1953, he's talking about world state. My other point is from this book, he's talking about in 1913 as a world state. So this is a continuing theme he had for decades and decades. It's not lifting a reference from one book out of context. Like some people who don't want to actually become literate and use their literacy for knowledge, they don't want to do that work. So they say,
I mean, he talks about re-education camps, man. I mean, he's like full on, like total world state Fabian.
Well, that's because George Bernard Shaw, who he's hanging out with in the Fabian Society, is also a big fan of what Cecil Rhodes did down there.
The camps, exactly.
Yeah, Milner's first war.
But it's like when you read the rest of the book, he's like, but I absolutely advocate. He even says at one point in there, we need a black plague to kill off the population. He says, I hope there will be a black plague, so that the people lie, and they're like, oh, he's like a liberal. He's not a liberal. He was playing the role of a liberal, just like H.G. Wells did in the Fabians. The Fabians are playing this role of fake liberal.
They're wolves in sheep's clothing, and they're loving it, man.
And I'm like, you tell people that, like, no, he was a good guy.
I got called out on that when I first presented the trivium. I went over his remarks on education and talked about Fichte and the idea of education, injections and diet.
As Fichte laid it down,
will create the type of ideal society, or type of the scientific ideal society. And so what I did was, in my logic course, when we went over the fallacies, I took the fallacy of excerpt lifting or quoting out of context and used that as one of the many examples, because all you had to do is keep reading. I took a paragraph, but all you got to do is keep reading, and it gets worse and worse and worse. I have a huge sort of diatribe went on with that, because it was very frustrating. That was Zach over 10 years ago, but
which is why we all do what we do, by the way, because like we're not hyperbolizing. It's much worse than what we can even tell you, and you need to look at this stuff for yourself to get a good understanding of what we're dealing with, so we can deal with some other mature adults on this topic, please.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to bring just kind of a selection of 100-year-old stuff up to now, so I kind of went. They're not in any specific order per se.
Right, so what's the
I didn't know where they were going to go. So obviously, everybody knows about Julian's philosophy UNESCO, which just restates the older eugenics plan as UNESCO. Essentially, it's renamed as
and like an environmental sort of like
and then but there's a lot in here that's overlooked as well, like the promotion of primitivism, shamanism, drug culture, a new kind of humanitarianism. He calls for technocracy. Cultural relativism has to be pushed. Ugly cities and ugly art, which is all part of that CIA co-opting of abstract art as part of the Congress of Cultural Freedom and all that kind of stuff to fight Soviet realism. Then he goes on to talk about using mass communications to control the masses, which we all know about now. This is one that people overlook too. There's a really good book on this. It's a big fat academic text, Chords of Memory, but using libraries and museums as tools of propaganda. And that's why the Rockefellers put so much money into a lot of the museums that are out there, was to inculcate various forms of propaganda.
A lot of the petroleum robber barons, like, you know, and
that's way you can
the Frick museums, the Carnegie, there's Rockefeller, there's Morgan Museum, there's that's good
The book,
observation.
yeah. So the philosophy of UNESCO ends with it says promoting a universal basic credit system for the entire world through UNESCO, and it says that the process is dialectical reconciliation of all opposites. This is why you have to know dialectics, and yeah, exactly, because they say that any position that's out there that is against some other position, they have to be through diapraxis reconciled into some new position, which is what will get us to the final global government.
So they have to reframe. Yeah. And this is the other reason people need philosophy, because these people are using advanced methods of philosophical sophism and solipsism against their audiences. Because it goes back to like during Christy Lee's clip, it was like the government's lying to all these people. Well, how does government lie? A lot of people have to believe those lies for the government to get any traction with that. So the problem is people are believing things that aren't true. And then you're helping them with each of these books that you're bringing to Timcast. Like, that's an unassailable reference. This is Julian Huxley.
Exactly.
And you don't point out he's the head of the World Eugenics Foundation. You say he's in charge of UNESCO, because he was doing both at the same time. UNESCO, United Nations, educational. Okay. So that's a check mark, green check mark type of, okay, well, let's break into that. Tim would have let you break into that. And then you're just busting out. It's all about eugenics and globalism. And it's not conspiracy theory. It's just Julian Huxley. Comes with the territory.
Exactly. We know this classic. Richard knows it very well. Between Two Ages, Brzezinski.
Yeah.
And I did get to throw in the Sutton reference there because of where he references Sutton's thing on the buildup of the Soviet Union.
Right, in that footnote.
Yeah, in the footnote. Yeah. So I did get to go into that a little bit and kind of throw in who Sutton was, although I didn't actually have any of Sutton's books with me. But I just wanted to bring mainly only global elite text. Yeah, right. I think everything I brought was from them
in their own words to overcome like the skepticality of someone like Tim Pool, who is embedded in daily news, because they're not telling you about any of this in daily news
memoirs.
Right.
Yeah.
I had those with me.
Did you bring those? So. Yeah, there it is. That's cool.
But and Luke referenced that one right away, so that was cool. But
well, he's actually met David Rockefeller and a lot of these other characters.
I know the first thing I said to him was hey Luke, sit down and shut up, because that's what Brzezinski said back to him when he confronted him at one time. I'll never forget it, right? Because Alex used to play Truth Rising, and then it would go from Truth Rising, and then it would go to Luke asking Brzezinski, I think about 9/11, and sit down and shut up.
Yeah,
sit down.
Just trying to ask a question,
right? And this one's pretty wild because like within 15 pages. Brzezinski's talking about mutating humans and making them into like toxic Avenger, basically. He's like literally saying we're going to create synthetic humans, mutate them through chemical tampering. This will actually lead to determining the sex of children in test tubes. Like that's literally page 15. And then he talks about, and we figure out some way to link them all into Skynet. He says that Charles DiCarlo in his essay Computer Technology in 1968 describes how holography can create the sensation of a living presence as well as the actuality of conversations by long-range laser beams from a satellite. So he's basically kind of talking about the internet and where we would go. And again, of course, the book is written in 72, 71, 72, 70. But I mean, within 15 pages, it's already crazy, right? Then in page 57, he's talking about weather weapons. You know what I mean? This is like it's hardcore. And then he gets into a human. People forget the religious chapter because he goes into the
universal religions and
using the world of the churches to become NGOs and soft power versions of world religion. He talks about blending Marxism with the West, this third position stuff,
which is kind of what's happened. That's postmodernism. That is postmodernism for the large extent. In other words, taking it out of an economic dialectic or material dialectic and put it into a cultural dialectic.
Yeah, and
the sort of relativity that's needed in order to perpetuate the disintegration of society.
Right. And I'm not saying this to try to offend Roman Catholics, but if you read David Wim Hof's book, which is a history of the CIA's relationship to the Vatican, it corroborates what's on page 94, where Brzezinski is basically saying that the U.S. government, the technocrat state, will need to utilize the Roman Catholic Church as an NGO. So he's corroborating that the plan was to use these entities, turn them into tools of social justice, not religions that operate on the basis of religious philosophy, but turn them to the purpose of the deep state, essentially, is what he's saying. And he says that we can utilize philosophers like Teilhard and these kinds of weirdo figures that are basically pushing a kind of new agey world religion.
Yeah, the phenomenology of man.
Phenomenon man, exactly. Yeah. So we didn't get
that's what the Pope is today. That's exactly that's literally what it's become. It's manifested as. In other words, pushing social issues, constantly talking about sort of like the idea of stakeholders, the idea of climate change, the idea of the people who are disadvantaged, the inclusive capitalism, the need for immigration, all these sorts of different elements that are used to destabilize nation states.
Between Two Ages, what year was it done?
1970.
All right, so 10 years before that, Sabine, you wrote this book.
I have that. Yeah.
Okay, and this is the first place I found where Carnegie and Rockefeller are funding him, right? So in 1960, because I have a reprint, right? Carnegie and Rockefeller were funding this book. So 10 years before he's coming out with that, Between Two Ages, he starts writing on their current projects, and they're like, "Oh, we like your work." And then he gets partnered up with this Rhodes Scholar, Sam Huntington.
Yep.
And then he starts writing more dialectical stuff, and then he writes Between Two Ages, and David Rockefeller says, "I really like this guy, let's make a trilateral commission together." And they pick up Jimmy Carter as their president, and Nelson Rockefeller graduates from vice presidency, and he moves on to an early death between a secretary's legs, allegedly.
And go ahead.
And so that Between Two Ages is picking up right at the time that the Club of Rome is saying there's a predicament with mankind, and we create this World Economic Forum, but they're also creating with Brzezinski these other groups like Trilateral that's supposed to bring in the Asian countries into this new world order dynamic.
One little tidbit that I picked up just between just the phraseology, what Julian was saying at the end of UNESCO document was that ultimately the philosophy to create this world government is the reconciliation of all opposites. And ironically, Aleister Crowley said the exact same thing from a totally different vantage point. So here you have these two figures essentially as adjuncts of the British imperial system saying the goal of what we'll have to push to get everybody to submitting to a world government is to getting rid of Aristotelian law of identity, law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction, and push the idea that all positions are the same position by
double think. Yeah,
exactly. That's what, and so Julian Huxley saying the same thing as the Satanist Aleister Crowley saying, because they're essentially working for British intelligence. So
yeah, I mean, the idea is they're creating a relativistic standpoint that nature itself is fundamentally in contradiction with itself. So we have to reach some sort of synthesis that will be sort of contrived, prescriptive, sort of from authority, to dictate what that reality fundamentally is, because it's constantly in what's the word I'm looking for, but in opposition to itself.
Yeah.
So there must be some grand resolution. The resolution, though,
inclusive capitalism.
Yeah, it's always something that comes from an authority that has just their own idealism or ideology behind it, rather than something that's fundamental that you can observe and try to deduce from nature itself.
Yeah, there's no objective truths because all truths are part of that. The process philosophy of everything working out.
It works in the presence of its opposite, is at least what they would claim. So everything is only known in the presence of its opposite. So that things exist on a spectrum of instead of differences in kind, it's differences sort of in degree. And that's a huge, huge problem that has continued its way forward, really, with Hume and Kant really providing the greatest specialist arguments in regards to instantiating it as a concept, and Hegel sort of making a weird sort of almost mystical religion out of it.
Mystical religion out of it, yeah. Next, I brought the two H.G. Wells books that we all know about, probably on this audience.
Oh yeah,
those titles seem to pique Tim's interest a little bit. So he was like, "Oh, Open Conspiracy, okay. Oh, New World Order, right?" So those seem to resonate just from the titles. We didn't really get to go into them, but they're classics. They're important.
Yeah, because now he can defend himself intellectually and say it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a 1938 or 1939 book by H.G. Wells and these sort of things. Yeah.
Did you get to didn't get a chance to watch the clip yet. We're going to do it tonight, but did you get a chance to go through most, like not through the books themselves, but at least get them on the screen and be like, these are real books that exist, and people should have an idea.
Yeah, a couple times we held the books up and talked about them.
Nice.
We didn't really go deep into any specific book except for maybe, I think we probably talked about Between Two Ages for the longest amount.
If you were to come to you and say, sorry to cut you off real quick, this maybe just think of a question I want to ask you. If he came to you and said, if we don't have time for all these books, but if there's one book you wanted to pick out, which one would you have chosen in that regard? If he said to do a deep dive on, let's say, within that sphere, even though that didn't get to happen necessarily, but I'm just curious what you would pick.
Probably the ones that I brought, I would have said either Klaus or Anglo-American Establishment would have been probably the best of all the ones that I brought.
Yeah, the Anglo-American Establishment is just...
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, the story of the Anglo-American Establishment can hold people's attention, because if you say a whistleblower from the secret society came to Quigley and told him this story, and he was so paranoid about it that he wouldn't publish the book during his lifetime, and then after he died, they published a book in 1981 that he wrote in 1948, and here's what it said. And in between that time, he published Tragedy and Hope in the 1,300-page form to kind of hide that story and point to it, but he hadn't published it yet. And then after he passes away, that book drops and it names names. And those names, when you look them up, makes a lot more sense than the official story. And it correctly has America's flag upside down in distress with the Union Jack overshadowing it. And yeah, he called it.
It also shows how they infiltrated every aspect of modern life, from media to education to finance. I mean, it's
infiltrated
the names of players
and insulated, because they infiltrated it, and then they kept that control since they killed Kennedy.
That's right.
I think that's the other thing that killed that scared Quigley, was he worked around all the people that were in on that whole Georgetown set. Yeah.
That's well said.
Cord Meyer.
When I did a deep dive into Tolkien and Lewis, they seem to have been somewhat spooked by what they noticed was being taught in the inner Oxford Cambridge circles about eugenics, and that's actually what. If you get into the space trilogy, it's explicitly about, the third one is about Tavistock and depopulation and transhumanism. And I also think that's what Lord of the Rings is about. That might be a little more debatable, but Tolkien makes Lewis makes Tolkien the hero in the third volume, which suggests to me that the Eye of Sauron and the development of technology and all that is actually a technocratic expose.
And then there's always the C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and JFK all passed away on the same day question. And then Bertrand Russell wrote a criticism. He wrote the first conspiracy theory, or one of the most popular early conspiracy theories on JFK's assassination. Bertie Burt did. So it's also interesting that he's writing cover for the MI6 CIA operation.
Do you think also
another nation state in there too, but
with Lewis's space trilogy, I think it was Lewis, right, that did that. I believe it was.
Yes, C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. In regards to, I mean, obviously the allegorical symbolism that you're pointing to, which I 100% agree, but you think it's also from the fact that they were very devout Christians, in the sense that they had a good, strong sort of metaphysical understanding as well. They debated. I mean, They had some issues in regards to, God and act or potency. We can get that, but still, yeah, there's many layers. There's like many dimensions from which you can sort of view the allegory, especially in like Tolkien's work. Maybe most specifically, I haven't gone through all of the space trilogy, where you also get sort of the rehashing of Christian, or even to some degree loosely Platonic ideas or Aristotelian ideas or Christian ideas, kind of. I mean, we can debate.
No, I don't think that's at all in question. I mean, the space trilogy, it's
as well as a critique of the culture, because you can see sort of the reflection of both of those, both metaphysically and what's being instantiated in the culture through these institutions, sort of carrying out for lack of a better term,
I mean, C.S. Lewis makes demons. Doctrine. He makes aliens demons. So
right.
And they're the ones that are promoting people to push the depopulation, and it's explicitly discovered as a kind of a demonic motivation that the demons hate humanity, but they're selling everybody through this institute, which is almost totally parallel to Tavistock, that if they accept this idea of uploading their consciousness to some machine, they can escape bodily existence and they'll become, godlike. There's actually a section too where they anybody that joins it's kind of a joke. It's called Nice. the institute for something, and it's like the most evil people on the planet. It's like, you know, Davos and Tavistock all combined together, but they actually put you through a ritual humiliation, which is intended to degrade you and compromise you. And so Mark, the central character,
That's
is kind of the
bones right there.
yeah, it's exactly like that. Yeah. So yeah, it actually blew me away. It was like way more prescient than I expected it to be. But yeah, it's definitely, both of them are Christian allegories in different ways. But yeah, that's a whole other thing. We did a breakdown on Alex, the fourth hour, that got a lot of views on that. If anybody's interested, I want to go deeper in that. But yeah,
you
so
see how like many layers you can analyze it, because you can analyze it geopolitically, but also metaphysically, also theologically. There's like, it's a multidimensional sort of tool, which makes it such a powerful literary expression for these complex ideas, what's happening in culture.
Yeah, he's also, they're both medievalists, so they were both really skilled at, you know, Lewis did a lot on literary theory and allegory and utilizing allegory in a way that like medievals did, and Tolkien was using it in a different way because he was influenced by Neoplatonism, but he was also very into the old Nordic texts, so he wanted a different approach from Lewis's approach. My godfather wrote the screenplay for what was supposed to be the Lewis Tolkien movie, so he's like an expert on that. That's the reason I know about this stuff, is from him. I mean, I've read the books, but I'm saying that the interplay between the two I also have access to, as somebody who went and spoke at the Tolkien Society.
C.S. Lewis was also into Mithraism, which is part of the Cambridge. I don't know if it's Cambridge.
Lewis was also
so the Inklings
until the very end, and then he sort of denounced it a little bit.
Well, I think there's such a connection between Mithraism and a lot of versions of flavors of Christianity out there. So it's not that incongruent. The singing to the sun, because they do like a boys' choir on the roof over there at the university, and it's pictured in that. There's a Anthony Hopkins C.S. Lewis movie.
It's a type of monism. It's a type
of
monism, so.
That does exist. So some of the Inklings were into ritual magic, the Golden Dawn. Charles Williams was a Golden Dawn member. I don't think they were all, but I do think you're right about the Neoplatonic point, that they kind of saw that as like the real overriding mythology here. So there's kind of a perennialism at work, but they're still good. Like they still have, in my view, a lot of value.
There's a lot of ideas, a lot of crossover between Neoplatonism and early patristic Christianity, although it's really where the details, the very specifics, where it makes them very different. But you know, the idea of the good, beauty, symmetry, order, unity, you know, there's like a crossover between the two ideas. So I can see why they are also against the Gnostics at the time. Neoplatonists and early Christian fathers were against the Gnostic heresies, because they neither saw matter as being debased or evil necessarily, because it was created in the image of the good, or for Christianity of God, and so forth. So there's a lot of crossover, but it's also, you know, differences as well. It's very detailed specifics of where those differences are that make them very different. But
correct. Yeah, the Cappadocians for the Orthodox, you know, they really focused on the goodness of the body for the doctrine of the bodily resurrection. And so even though some of the concepts are used for the Trinity or for the doctrine of the divine ideas, the locus of a lot of their apologetics is against Neoplatonic argumentation. So the Trinity doctrine, for example, is the big debate that they have with Eunomius, and Eunomius's whole system is essentially a version of Neoplatonism. So if you go all the way up until the Seventh Council, they're still battling Neoplatonism, because the motivation behind iconoclasm is also Neoplatonic. So I'm not trying to disagree or fault what you're saying, because I completely agree. You were saying that it's a both and
specifics. Yeah, there's specifics that make them very different. They were definitely at odds with one another. There's no doubt about that. And that's what this out of my research as well.
This book that I'm reading right now is really good, because it traces that same battle all the way up into Byzantium, and there's the confrontation between the Neoplatonism of Plethon is what is the real locus of ideological argument in the Byzantine Empire.
Now, didn't you mention that one last night?
I did mention it because I didn't know where.
Because I was like, okay, Jay just said Byzantine. Let's see what kind of action he gets on the table with it.
I just thought I would throw in something kind of, you know, out there, like, has Byzantine Empire been mentioned on Timcast? Probably not.
No, you're the first one to mention Plethon. It's all in the record books now.
Well, the reason he's relevant though is that this guy, it's a really well done Cambridge text. He's arguing that radical Platonism in Byzantium led to the Illuminati, the actual historical Illuminati, via the influences on Spinoza and Spinoza's pantheism, which leads to some of these Enlightenment philosophers being influenced by this form of evolutionary Platonism. And you can see the same thing with Hegel, because Hegel has the same type of thing. He's influenced by Kant and Spinoza as well. But anyway, so we didn't really go into that book though. But I did bring Jacques, our buddy, the Kissinger of France, Jacques Attali. This is a key global elite text from 2006, which Kissinger recommends. And he was the mentor, kind of like, Quigley was a mentor to Clinton. He was the mentor to Mitterrand or Chirac. I forget which one he was the mentor to, but he's essentially, again, like we have these deep state figures that are always just in the background and never, get in any trouble. The Kissingers, the Brzezinskis. So Jacques Attali is one of those. And this book is wild. I mean, it's comparable, I guess, to Klaus's book, but 10, 12 years before Klaus's Fourth Industrial Revolution, because he actually gives you decade actuaries. Like, here's what we want by 2030, which is fascinating because this is 2006. And a lot of what has rolled out by now is what he talks about. He talks about internet currencies. He talks about what he called at that time nomadic devices. And he means these.
Yeah.
And how the nomadic devices, he said, would basically create rootless consumers, people with no heritage, no land, no tradition, no family, just bugmen, basically. He says that we would all be watching live streams. So here we are watching live streams. He placed that actually a little bit later. He said by 2030, it would all be live streams. But he was close enough, I guess. Other fascinating elements that nobody really thought about before that, we can't forget the gamification idea, which a lot of the tech Silicon Valley elites talk about in terms of how society is with all these points, reward points and all this stuff. And that now that things are going into everything being online, we're getting into everything being gamified, which is intended ultimately to kind of get you to opt into the tracking and the tracing and say, oh, did you brush your teeth this morning? You'll get 5 Pokey points if you brush your teeth, right? This kind of a thing. So living your whole life out online in a kind of nonstop IRL stream is what he envisioned, at least us going into, and everything being part of gamification, right?
So he wrote this after Black Mirror, though?
No, this was 2006.
Okay, well, that's just right before it then. All right.
Right before what Black.
Right.
But he's sort of thinking about it from almost an economist standpoint. I think he was an economist. So, or like he's like portrayed as such, but his idea is like in sort of game theory markets.
Correct. And then he goes on to say,
with social engineering. Sorry.
We'll use mass movements of migrants, migration. You can guess what I mean there. I know that's not friendly on YouTube, but this is
we
a
don't
tool.
care, dude. You can say anything you want. I don't.
It's a tool, right,
We're on a
of
pirate
moving
channel
populations around
on YouTube.
And he even says that populations are a form of weaponry, which I have Kelly Greenhill's book, Weapons of Mass Migration, which you're not supposed to talk about, but it's a known public. That's a Stanford Naval War College produced text about populations being weapons. But if you talk about it, you're an evil person, even though it's a military strategy.
ISIS has done that too. They've said they're using population.
Yeah, remember Erdogan was
migration.
like, if you don't do what I want, I'll flood you with immigrants.
Yeah.
Anyways, he says that what this will do is basically mass migration everywhere will destroy everything to be put into a global governance. And then he goes on to talk about carbon scam. He talks about how we'll continue the pollution narrative, that humans are the real problem. That's what pollution is about. And then it really gets amazing at the end. And he says that where are we at? We are at the stage right before the planetary empire. Right. So what's the planetary empire? Well, that is first by 2040, the end of America, the integration of everything into the global internet world market through nanotech. He says nanotech will be key to create this world market. And he says by 2040, there will be bots everywhere that are between you and the external world. So you won't interact with you won't go on the internet and search whatever you want about what's going on in China. There will be a personal AI tailored to you that tells you what you need to know. He says this. He says what you need to know about the external world. You won't find out.
Bots.
You have a bitch bot, like basically bitching you around, telling you what you can and can't do. And literally, he's like, you won't go to school because you have this bot. This bot is your school. It is your life.
These people are so lame. They needed
so
to go
crazy,
to a
man.
park or go hiking or something.
Everything
instead of doing
becomes a
what they did.
everything becomes a simulacrum of reality. It's like
You
they
know,
hate
one thing-
reality so much they have to reinvent reality.
Yeah, it's
artificial
crazy.
means. Yeah.
There's another two texts that really hit on the importance of the medical side of this, which a lot of people overlook. Not talking about you guys, I'm talking about in general. Like when we think, oh, the New World Order is the government. Yeah, but what about medicine? Right. And that was to be the secret kind of back door. Look at all the COVID stuff, right? Medicine is and he says this as well as Friedrich Copper did in Turning Point, that medicine would be the secret kind of back door by which all of the mass surveillance would come through, because he says we will use medicine because that's the thing that everybody's the most afraid of and what all people sort of default to their doctors as the authority. He says health will be the new fighting ground to actually bring in the New World Order. I think Bill Gates said something like that pretty
It
recently.
makes sense
too.
because of the adherence to the authority mindset is so strong, especially when people are under sort of like an internal conflict with their
Fear
health.
of like, I'm going to get sick. Yeah.
Exactly.
Then he goes on to say, it gets really crazy, not so much in 2030, but 20, by the way, global sports, he says. Key to bringing in the global government is the promotion of global sports, which I think we are beginning to see that. For example, I mean, if people like soccer, that's fine. I don't care whether you like soccer or not, but soccer, he says, is because it's a global sport. When we import that to the United States, this gets everybody in the mindset of, oh, it's the United States soccer teams versus the other global soccer teams. He says it's nothing to do with the sports. It's only to promote globalism. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Same with the NFL going to Germany or the UK and trying to expand their brand. The NBA is very global now. You see that in China.
Right.
They're massive in China and the East. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to fortify real quick your commentary on the control the medical system, control the education system. That's the Rockefellers and the
Right.
key characters that the Flexner family.
Yeah.
So there was the Flexner report, right? And that has influence over that's Abraham Flexner, medicine men. Well, there's three brothers, so let me just explain it. There's Abraham Flexner, and he does the Flexner report for Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie into medical schools. There's Bernard Flexner, who does the Palestine Economic Corporation, Rockefeller Foundation activities over there in Israel, what will become Israel. Simon Flexner, who also did medical research. So maybe Abraham did the educational report, but there was reports on education and medical by the Flexners, and they were like Renfields for the Rockefeller medical establishment and educational establishment. So
kind of reminds me of the British State Department utilizing sort of the ideological movements in the early 19th.
Three Flexners, three Warburg brothers. You gotta learn them all.
So he goes on to talk about clones, sexuality be completely removed from reproduction. It'll be completely related to individual pleasure, and all human beings will be grown in test tubes, which we saw.
So we need chemical castration to make the eunuchs, because how is that going to happen otherwise? You need Albert Bourtain Borla and his Improvac made for humans.
There you go. Yeah. Then he says there will actually be temptations for people to try to bring back various forms of traditionalism,
like having relations and having babies.
Well, he says that we have to be foremost concerned about Jews, Christians, Muslims reacting against this. And he says that the key to this will be co-opting all of those religious institutions to become basically NGOs so that they don't react to when we bring this in. He says there will be a temptation in America to turn to a theocracy by 2050, he says. Now, I mean, that may be outlandish, but he predicts, and by the way, H.G. Wells did too, didn't it? In Shape of Things to Come, he predicts these counter-revolutionary figures that get squashed, right?
Yeah, they get
almost
squashed. And
through
he
like
also,
a COINTELPRO sort of Hoover FBI directed sort of invest where you infiltrate and muddy the waters, create narrative control. I mean, Pope Francis is that quite literally for Roman Catholics.
Yes.
And you see that with secular Judaism in regards to
Right.
Zionism, specifically Zionism. So,
which is a
and I don't know
political
as much about
strategy.
It's political strategy too, and you can see in Chaim Weizmann
Well, he's writing
many of the
letters back and
founders
forth
of-
with Rhodes, Cecil
Well, they s-
Rhodes. They're like, we want to set up an apartheid state like you got in South Africa.
They also say specifically they despise the religious Jew, quite literally, and that they wanted to create a sort of one that embraces secular ideals over, religious ideals, and that's their ideas behind Zionism. So whether it's Weizmann or there's a couple.
These are all things that Crowder couldn't talk about if he took that $50 million. He would have to have a very set position on that topic and not entertain other pieces of evidence.
One of the best quotes in the book is where he says that the vanguard of the new hyper democracy, which is what he says the future global governance will be hyper democracy. What is that? He says, oh, that's just transhumanism. He says the transhumanists are the vanguard of the new order on page 260, 261. That's one of the best quotes in this book. And then the craziest part is where he says by 2100, we would hope to have complete global unification, continental unions, and everyone integrated into the global brain.
The Borg.
And he calls it Gollum. I'm not joking. That's his word.
Well, he doesn't know at that time that so many people have seen Lord of the Rings movies.
No.
Maybe he does. I guess he does.
No,
right?
he's talking about the medieval Jewish
the idea
creation,
of
the Gollum.
Yeah.
Okay.
Golem. Sort
And
of
he's
like,
saying that we will actually create the Gollum, and it will be when every human being is integrated into the Borg.
an idea is that everything is sort of stitched together and then artificially create like a Frankenstein like monster.
Yeah, and in the Frankenstein, the Gollum doesn't have a will.
Exactly.
So when you hear Noah Yuval Harari saying there is no free will, you don't have this anymore. This is
Well, that's the Illuminati.
Yeah.
Which is what Mary Shelley, Mary Bysshe Shelley, what's that? Mary Shelley. She wrote Frankenstein. She's married to Percy Bysshe Shelley at the time, and Frankenstein takes place in Ingolstadt, right? So she's writing about the Illuminati in the place of the Illuminati a couple decades after they had kicked off, and they've sewn this thing together that's out of control.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Frankenstein is a golem, and it is an image of the transhumanist creation. But that's there. He's saying that that's for controlling everyone. That's not for the elite who are going to be immortal. He does talk about the elite supposed to getting immortality in that book. But yeah, I brought another overlooked one that is really wild. I know that people have heard of this, but he's overlooked because of the just insane admissions at the end of this book. It's one of the best ones to get people to see the craziest part of this stuff. For example, when he talks about drugging all of the water, putting pharma pills in all the world's tap water. And he says that when we do this, he says it will be the alchemist's dream.
What book is that?
It's Kessler's Ghost of the Machine.
Well, transmutation.
He also wrote
Yeah,
13th Tribe, Kessler did.
Correct.
Yeah.
He actually has a bunch of wild books.
Yeah,
But
Kessler is an interesting figure. I'll have to go to my email.
he says human sacrifice, ritual human sacrifice was one of the best things that happened, because when that happened, humans evolved and it limited population. So he's one of these guys that's like, we need to bring that back. You know, you hear Alex always saying that the UN diversity assessment talks about bringing back human sacrifice and this kind of stuff. And I mean,
every civilization has practiced it.
Yeah, and Kessler says this was nothing bad. It's just part of nature, right? So we need to bring this back. He talks about the Aztecs and all of the good parts of human sacrifice. But the best part, as I said, is that the book ends with him saying that, and a lot of people don't know this, that he cites the Dr. Holger Hayden, who is cited in the 1969 CIA mind control conference that took place in California, I think San Francisco. Dr. Holger Hayden has papers that he wrote, which I dug up. You can't find them anymore, but they're on flipping genetics in men and women. That was one of the papers that was at this 1969 CIA mind control conference about making women more masculine and men more feminine through artificial means in the environment, food, water.
Was that time frame overlap with the
inoculations.
Congress for Cultural Freedom that was going on? Was that the same time? Because Kessler was part of that, I thought.
Yes, he is. But what I'm saying is that there's this whole other conference by, look, he says, he says humans are manimals, and manimal must have breeding control. But he says, since man is an evolutionary freak, there's nothing wrong with experimenting with the freaks. That's his terminology, right? So if man's an evolutionary freak, then what better thing to do than to fix the freak? And he says that it's no different than when man was eating man. When man ate man, he became the next phase of evolution in his view. And he says, so we're not doing anything different as the priest class. And he says that we will have to use mind control and genetic modification because man is so irrational that he must be controlled in this total. By the way, he committed suicide, by the way. So he was completely insane. Total maniac. It says that here it is. The 1961 University of California, San Francisco Medical Center put on a symposium called Control of the Mind. That's the CIA's mic. It's sponsored by the CIA and Radio Liberty. At the first session, Dr. Holger Hayden, who is the guy who wrote the paper on flipping genetics and making men women, presented his paper, Biochemical Aspects of Brain Activity. And he goes on to say that Holger is the leading guy in this field. And there he talks not so much about the men and women, but he goes on to cite this paper at length about what can we do to use mind control to convince everyone to stop having natural births. And if they won't be convinced through the mind control, how can we convince them or force them to be sterile through other big pharma means, he says. So mass sterilization is what he says must happen. And then he says, get this is a thing that you hear Alex mention all the time that everybody overlooks: binary weapons. He says the best way to do this, according to Holger Hayden, cited by Kessler, is to have secret inactive ingredients that are in different aspects of the environment that when put together cause the sterilization. And then it says you can't figure out who did it. You can't track it.
And you can't sue them. And they've already used this plausible deniability in the court cases before.
Here it is, 334 binary weapons right there.
It's hard to argue with facts.
And then he goes on to say, and if none of this works, then we'll just put it in the water, the tap water.
Yeah, because they love you. They're looking out for your best non-productive, non-reproductive life for you.
Trying to find the for Arthur Kessler. He was
Congress for Cultural Freedom
Cultural
ended right before
that's
what Jay
I'm
was just
thinking
talking about.
Congress for Cultural Freedom. He was one of the key architects culturally behind sort of
codenamed CK Ultra.
what
I
was
think
the
it was.
project?
Hayden
after
also has a paper, if
the
I
rebuilding
recall.
of Europe. I'm sorry, go ahead.
There's another paper I found years ago. I think it's Holger Hayden. If not, it's one of the people in his circles, about fixing dementia in elderly people. But then there's a section where he says, by the way, this can also be weaponized to cause dementia in the population on a mass scale. So,
well, when you look at the Congress for Cultural Freedom, that was the predecessor to what you were just talking about with the kind of sex swapping neurochemicals. Bertrand Russell, Huxley's, we were just talking about, happened to be influential over that. So you can guess there's some eugenics in there. You can guess there's some Fabian socialist technologies in there being precipitated down on people. You got Freddie A.J. Ayer, and he's a big propaganda guy. Yeah.
Logical positivist, AJ?
Yeah, and he was British intelligence. AJ Ayer was a British worked for MI6, I think.
That
And
makes
then,
a lot of sense because a lot of positivism. Well, he came up with like a sort of branch of positivism from what's called logic.
Yeah, I think let's see, Isaiah Berlin, Kurt Quigley in this one mentions philosopher Isaiah Berlin being part of the helpers. I don't think he was in the inner circle, but I think he was one of the helpers of the
Society of Helpers.
Yeah.
Very
And I want to say maybe Popper, but I'm not 100% sure.
Oh, that would be fascinating. Popper as well. That would make a lot of sense.
Let me see if he mentions Popper.
As you do that, real quick, Congress for Cultural Freedom. This is what I was thinking of in August 1949. Arthur Kessler, Ruth Fisher, Franz Birkenau, and Melvin Lasky met in Frankfurt to develop a plan where the CIA could be persuaded to fund a left-wing but anti-communist organization. The plan was then passed on to Michael Josselson, who was the chief of its Berlin station for covert action. Finally, it reached Josselson's boss, Lawrence de Neuville. He later recalled, quote, "The idea came from Lasky, Josselson, and Kessler. Then I got Washington to give it the support it needed. I reported it to Frank Lindsay, and I guess he must have taken it to Frank Wisner. He had to beg for approval. The Marshall Plan, that's what I was saying. The Marshall Plan was the slush fund used everywhere by the CIA at the time. Also think of Operation Gladio at the time as sort of a part of the diverging funds into creating radical nationalist groups in the post-war environment. But anyways, that's the
Frank Wisner died of suicide, allegedly.
Really?
Yeah.
That's another one.
Kessler is another one of these figures too, who is I believe he grows up a Hungarian Marxist, committed Marxist, but then suddenly becomes a British order of the British Empire. He's awarded this, and he's brought into the Royal Society. And
like an honorific title or something like that.
Yeah, and then he puts out these books about eugenics because he realizes that, oh, this is actually not a Marxist versus capitalist thing. This is a run at a higher level that has a longer plan.
Yeah.
And he was, and according to, if you read his bio on Wikipedia, it's like, oh, I'm so committed to this that my wife and I are going to commit suicide together. This is how much we believe in this death cult. So at least the public story is that they committed suicide together. And then of course we all know this one in your audience. Everybody's very familiar with this. I brought it. It didn't come up, but they seemed curious about it when they saw it. I was like, what's that flag there? That weird sort of British American upside down flag. So,
well, Tim, you know that when the United States flag is upside down, it's a symbol of being in distress.
Distress. Yeah.
We're deep capture right now. Like our entire lifetime, we've been running by a foreign entity.
Richard, I know you've seen this video, this one, because I did a video many years ago about
that. Yeah. That's a hard one to get, dude.
Yeah, but I brought it just because I thought like the stabbies might come up, and I didn't know where they would want to go with that. I know it's not that safe for YouTube, but it didn't come up, so we didn't really get to go into it. I did mention the priest class and the survival of the priest class, I think, something like that. But I said Klaus's book to kind of tie it all together and show that, you know, there's continuity of agenda here for the last 150 years.
And a lot of those other books represent ideas. Klaus represents the instantiation of those ideas to a working committee.
Yeah, he's like the marketing for
it's a great reset. Yeah, I think Luke mentioned this book 3 or 4 times when he saw it sitting over there. We didn't really go into it, but he pointed out some of the big quotes, you know, the whole, I mean, there's a lot of gems.
Internationalist.
There's a ton of gems in this, but yeah, the famous chapter where he says, I am a proud internationalist, and you know, people accuse us of a conspiracy. Well, I say yes. But that if you read the rest of that chapter, it's just as good as that, because that goes into Bilderberg, it goes into all the steering committees, CFR is the first thing, then it goes to Bilderberg, Prince Bernhard, all the classics, right? He even mentions Opus Dei, by the way, for the Roman Catholics, because that's of course deeply connected to the CIA. Yeah. Ultimately, CIA is basically just another Rockefeller creation as well. And he says that, yeah, I was an intelligence asset. And by the way, I learned how to do all this and make these networks through my intelligence time as an intelligence operative.
Yeah, he got back in World War II, but he was making the intelligence networks for Standard Oil.
Yep, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for the family. So he was doing it for private interest. Yeah. And by the way, it's funny because he's got all these pictures in the middle of his meeting with the communists, like when he flew over to China. I met with Khrushchev in 1964. I thought he would be a good man, a good leader for that time. I met with Zhou Enlai of the People's Republic of Beijing. So he's flying over there meeting with all of the, here we go. Here's a clock. Look what I found. It's me in my book, my Rockefeller book. It's me and the Beastmaster. And when I met the Beastmaster, he was a complete douchebag, by the way. He was a total dick.
Heroes.
I didn't realize that you're supposed to pay for getting a picture with him. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And he literally followed me out and was like,
hey,
write me a check for, I don't have any cash.
He's like, they're not making any more Beastmasters anymore.
You write the check to Beastmaster. Yeah. Anyway, this one, we didn't go into it at all, but this is a classic. I really love this one because, I mean, this book is one of the most important for understanding how this stuff gets trickled down and implemented.
Yeah.
Because Miles Copeland is just saying, and you don't realize it until you get to the very end, when he tells you, if you want to understand what I'm up to, he tells you what books to read. And he says, read Bertrand and Russell and read the Council on Foreign Relations publications.
Yeah.
He's like, that's what the CIA is up to.
100%. Like they have the council, and then they have the work group, and the CIA is the work group out there getting those things done. And Miles Copeland was working, he was hand trained by MI6 through the X2 double cross system to go perform coups on Mossadegh and all sorts of
even
Arbenz and all, you know, for years.
Well, even with the creation of the CIA, didn't Rockefeller put him up the MI6?
He put up British security coordination,
British security coordination,
and Rockefeller Center. So MI6 has been, that's just the Anglo-American establishment, though. That's the point. Like the Rockefellers are the American side of that establishment, and so they're like, here's real estate for you to set up your espionage circuit in America before we're even into World War II. Well, they made sure we got into World War II.
The first chapter is about he mentions the report from Iron Mountain, and he's like, this is kind of a satire. He's like, but actually the report from Iron Mountain is based on something real. That's the first chapter. And he says that if you go to the CIA's, what he was calling at that time, their situation room, or like their game room. He's like, what we did was we were just trying to map out everything in terms of game theory for all of these regional conflicts and see who would be winners and losers. And he's like, the report from Iron Mountain is satire, but it's also true because that's what we were doing in the game center, was doing this stuff. And then he goes into, it's all pure pragmatic power politics. It's a zero-sum game. And he's like, let me explain to you the rules of the game. And then, I mean, there's so many gems in this. It's like, it should be its own lecture course. There's so much in there. I mean, everything from like funding the terrorists and creating the terror. There's a whole chapter on creating terror. To, like I said, he says, if you want to understand what we're up to, here's what you should read. First publications are Council on Foreign Relations. He lists several things. And then he says, check out James Burnham. So you've probably heard of him, Managerial Society, right? All that kind of stuff. He says, read The Machiavellians by Burnham, read Power by Burnham. Then he says that these are important because he was a consultant to the CIA during the period covered in the chapters of this book. So if you want to understand the modern Machiavellian attitude of those in the CIA, particularly here Burnham, you want to read these books. Then he says, read some books that have to do with ecology and environmentalism and pushing environmentalism. Then he says you need to understand the Rand Corporation. He says, because we are implementing the stuff that we get, that Herman Kahn and these people study, that then we implement. And he says one particular text would be The Year 2000 by Herman Kahn, which was about the goals of what we wanted to introduce here. And so the point of that is that a lot of what he says in this book is that you might think that we're modernizing and industrializing and updating Egypt because we want to help them. Right. No, it has nothing to do with helping these people. In fact, he says we brought Hollywood in because when we bring Hollywood in, we know that Hollywood controls cultures. We export Hollywood to other countries, he says, to control them. Anyway, he goes on to say that technocracy is key. And he says, you need to read about Bertrand Russell and all these guys. He says, here's a bunch of OSS people to read. So, I mean, if you don't think that, and here's the CIA guy saying, go read the Rand Corporation, the CFR, and Bertrand Russell to understand what we are doing. I mean, can't be any plainer than that. And there's just amazing chapters on like how we ran these false flags, how we control public opinion of the events, how we do this, that, fake student riots. I mean, anything you could think of, it's in here.
Not only that, but who's his son?
Well, he's related to Stewart. I don't think Stewart's his son.
I thought, or maybe his grandfather, Stewart and Miles. Copeland, they're definitely related.
They're related, but I don't think he's Stewart's father, but I forget, they're like brothers or cousins. I forget, something like that. But
there is a relationship.
Well, but he went and Stewart was involved in setting up like record stuff. And so he was doing, in my view, things related to the CIA for the music industry.
The cultural rather than geopolitical.
It fits in with the patterns of the Corda brothers making films and using it as a front company.
As a front.
Yeah. They did H.G. Wells's Things to Come, by the way, that we talked about earlier.
By the way, he mentions Muslim Brotherhood being and working with and for MI6 and the CIA, which
created by
is supposed
St. John
to-
Philby a couple
which is
decades
supposed to be a
earlier.
conspiracy theory, but here you have CIA operatives telling you that that's what they do. A plan and stage terror, plan and stage coups run by the CIA. Here's this is a great quote. When we use terrorists, they are just useful losers, and we use them with finesse.
They have a certain techne, if you will, or technique. Plus, it's a zero-sum game. So, however they're going to use them, the terrorists are always going to lose because the narrative they've been given as part of the game isn't fundamentally.
And they
true.
need
I just think
proxy
it's so,
forces.
it's so wild that he's like, they're losers. We're just picking like low IQ people that are losers, and he says, and we play them with finesse.
Yeah,
they
like
look at it like they're
Saddam
just
Hussein.
marionettes.
All right, St. John Philby
Okay.
in this book, and then also the eminent Georgians, St. John Philby, Nancy Astor, the Cliveden set,
Yeah, the
Right.
Cliveden set. Yeah.
right? So there are some connections by the people in this book, and Philby was a key character who helped to set up the stranglehold.
Saudi
on
Arabia,
Saudi
well,
Arabia.
yeah. So the T. Lawrence and Philby, they all went and they were the Arabists for the
Yes.
British Empire, right? So they went and pretended or acted as if they were converts to Islam and wore the costumes and the headgear, and but they were the first ethnographers, sort of imbibing themselves in the culture, like CIA later does with ethnography. So that was most of what I brought. I didn't bring Tragedy and Hope just because it was so big. I couldn't fit in that duffel bag. But yeah, so that's all the text that I took.
You have Plummer's Tragedy and Hope 101.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good one to have on hand. All right, so that was a wide spectrum, and you only got to a couple of those books during the show, but that leaves room on the table for an invite back so that you can go a little bit deeper, because I think that they're really close. Like Crowder's behind Tim. Like Crowder's not going to talk about eugenics or global government, but he will talk about a little bit about Davos, right? So, but Tim's show is kind of that. I mean, outside of
gap, I mean, a
InfoWars
co-host
a
is
little
Lou
further.
Grudowski,
Yeah.
for goodness sake, who's a little bit
Yeah.
more aware of these narratives. And they had a debate about this like a year ago in regards to
Oh,
the
really?
importance of looking. Yeah, Lou Grudowski and Tim.
They always go head
Tim
to head.
Pool they had a little bit of a
Oh,
debate that we played on the show in regards to whether it's important or not to pay attention to these technocrats, and sort of Tim Pool's making the stand that the world's too complex to assume that these players have any real control. And obviously, and since then, though, I have to say he's been a little bit more, since that altercation or that sort of debate, quote unquote, he's been a little bit more open as time's gone on in regards to
Tim
the
would
idea of
express-
looking at these individuals. I think the problem is he gets frustrated because he's like, these are so many names, dates, places, events. It's almost impossible for me to make any sort of sense of this that I can intelligibly communicate to a very large audience that wants 15-minute sound bites,
Right.
on YouTube. And so like it's not so much, he's not saying there isn't an effect there, but he's saying like, how am I going to make this something that people can actually understand and make actionable?
We
And
too have that question, and
Yeah.
we're working on it. But the
It's a
gist
big
is,
challenge.
you
It
can't
is.
get people the answer. You can't get people this solution set that we're talking about right here so freely, because they have short attention spans. So the first
Yeah.
thing they need to do is watch like Timcast for 3 hours or something like that, and make a bigger attention span, and then get more substantial content on a consistent basis to that audience. And slowly they would outgrow that status quo, and they would see it's not a caricature. It's not cartoonish. There's not people in the back room twisting their mustaches being evil, but they do sit around and do these things.
That's a
and they're not
continuation of ideas.
they're not incompetent. They're
Yeah, they're highly
amoral.
competent, right?
Yeah, very confident, right? And it's a continuation of philosophies, ideas, geopolitical strategies that actually span centuries. In some
And
cases,
represent
millennia.
sociopathy and psychopathy. That's the
Oh,
other reason
absolutely,
we
from a
should be
psychological
informed about
standpoint.
this.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're legit crazy.
Yeah, that's why they have to use such crazy rationalizations and all these terms, positivism or the analytic tradition of the 20th century, or a pragmatism, utilitarianism of Bentham. I mean, it's just all these isms that get people
It's the
so
birth
confused. When in
pods
fact, it's
and
just
the suicide
denying
pods.
reality. Yeah, there you go.
And your life in between on a screen.
Right.
That's what they're doing. It's anti-human. It's disrespectful, and they're not creators. That's why they have to be destroyers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well said.
All right. Well, that was a good arsenal of books to take. And then you got some extracurricular activity. You got to hang out with them a little bit before and after the show. So you got
Yeah, I got
sense
to
of-
pretend I was James Bond wearing my flashy things at the casino and losing $300 immediately at the roulette table. So yeah.
we got to support the house, man. You know, the house pays for all those tables and people to sit at them and the cards. It's all expensive stuff. So you got to donate to the house.
Well,
before
I tend to hand me the first $100 bill, which I lost 95 of that, and then gave him the last 5 for him to then try to win it back. But then I was like, all right, I'm gonna go lose my money instead of your money, and then I successfully did. I successfully
Yeah.
lost my. But it's just fun. I have mixed experiences with roulette where I'm not a big gambler, but every now and then we go and have fun.
like I like the statistics of it. Like roulette's first off, it's one of the only games where you have a decent
50-50.
chance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
definitely.
if I wait for, you know, red to come up 3 times in a row and I bet black, you know, there's a statistic thing there that says a 50-50 any, you know, chance. But
Yeah.
if you wait for a couple things to come up like in a pattern, it'll
Right.
break that pattern usually.
Yeah.
So, but I don't do that for a living, obviously.